February 13th, 2018. Lake Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The water is still. The sun is just beginning to rise over the mountains. And on a small boat drifting near Sunup Bay sit Lori and Larry Eisenberg, married 14 years, out on the water together, the way they had been so many mornings before. Larry is 68 years old. He'd just gotten over the flu. This trip was his idea, a way to thank his wife for taking care of him. A sunrise cruise, breakfast afterward at the resort down the lake. By mid-morning, none of that has happened. Instead, Lori Eisenberg is on the phone with 911. Her husband is gone. She tells the dispatcher he leaned over to check a stalled motor and fell into the water. She wonders aloud if he'd had a stroke. To understand what happened to Larry Eisenberg, you first have to understand who he was. Larry was born and raised in Idaho. He went on to study at the University of Idaho, where he earned a degree in forestry. A fitting path for a man who spent much of his life close to the land, working in the lumber industry. Those who knew him described someone almost impossible not to like. His son Dean remembers him as a man who greeted every single day the same way, with a smile and the words, "Every day is the greatest day I've ever had." Larry used to joke that he intended to live so long, his doctor would eventually have to make house calls on Mars. Larry had 2 children from his first marriage, Dean Isenberg and Jessica McPherson, and he stayed close to both of them throughout his life. To Dean, Larry wasn't just a father. He was, in his own words, my world. By the time Larry met Lori, he had already built a life of quiet contentment. Together, the couple settled into a home on Bobcat Trail, just outside Coeur d'Alene, a sprawling property with a garden, a pond, and hummingbirds that would visit every summer. Lori once posted a photo of it online, calling it simply, "Our little paradise." To everyone on the outside, Larry adored his wife without reservation. Lori's own daughter, Chrislyn Woolston, later told Dateline that Larry looked at her mother with eyes of just admiration, that he would tell anyone who'd listen just how amazing she was. This was the life Larry Eisenberg believed he was living. A retirement built on love, on land he'd worked hard for, on a marriage he trusted completely. He had no way of knowing that the woman he adored was keeping a secret from him, one that, within weeks, would put his life in danger inside the very home they shared. To the community of Coeur d'Alene, Lori Eisenberg was a woman who helped people. She served as executive director of the North Idaho Housing Coalition, a nonprofit that took foreclosed homes, restored them, and gave families with little money a place to live. It was work built on trust, and Lori had earned plenty of it. She was also a mother of 6 daughters from her first marriage to her high school sweetheart, Steve. That marriage ended in 1996. By the time she married Larry in 2004, Lori had already raised a family of her own, and she'd go on to become a grandmother many times over. To those who knew her, she was generous, capable, the kind of person a nonprofit board could hand its finances to without a second thought. But underneath that reputation, something else had been happening for years. Lori Eisenberg was quietly siphoning money out of the very organization she led. She created what investigators would later call ghost companies, businesses that existed only on paper, registered under her own name and the names of her daughters. Payments from the nonprofit flowed into them. From there, the money disappeared into her own life. She opened credit cards the board never approved, some of them in her husband's name, others in her daughter's name. Every one of them used to fund personal spending. Investigators eventually traced over $41,000 in deposits from the nonprofit's account directly onto a Chase credit card that belonged to Larry, money moving through her husband's name without his knowledge. Even property wasn't off limits. A home owned by the nonprofit was rented out to one of Lori's own daughters, with months of unpaid rent that simply vanished from the books. When it finally came out, Lori offered an explanation. She said she'd started stealing to help her daughters and grandchildren, who were struggling financially. Money, she said, she felt she couldn't ask her husband for. Whatever her reasons, one fact remained. For years, there were 2 Lori Eisenbergs. The one the world saw, a trusted leader, a devoted grandmother, and the one hidden underneath, a woman quietly draining hundreds of thousands of dollars from a nonprofit, while the man she was married to had no idea what was happening under his own roof. That secret couldn't stay buried forever, and when it finally surfaced, it would set off a chain of events that ended with Larry Eisenberg's life. To understand what happened on the morning of February 13th, you have to look at the days that led up to it, hour by hour. February 9th. 4 days before the boat ride, Larry sends an email to his physician, Dr. Cher Jacobson. He describes flu symptoms he'd picked up during a recent trip to Florida. The shakes, terrible equilibrium, and even my brain was foggy, he writes. But he adds that he's improving. He's optimistic. He has no idea what's coming. February 12th, one day later, Lori is officially terminated from the North Idaho Housing Coalition. The newspaper story exposing her is set to publish at any moment. February 13th, early morning, Lori and Larry launch their boat from Sunup Bay. The plan, according to Lori, is simple. Watch the sunrise together, then head to the Coeur d'Alene resort for breakfast. That breakfast never happens. Here is what Lori told investigators. She said Larry noticed something wrong with one of the boat's motors. He leaned over to check it and fell into the lake. She said she hurt herself trying to reach him and that her nose began to bleed. She waited roughly 2 hours before calling 911, later explaining that she'd left her own phone at home and believed Larry had his phone with him when he went into the water. In emails to friends afterward, she painted a picture of a man still weak from the flu, suggesting he may have suffered a stroke, which caused him to fall. The Kootenai County Sheriff's Office launches a water search almost immediately. Boats comb the surface. Divers go down into the cold. Hour after hour, day after day, nothing. Larry Eisenberg does not surface. 16 days pass. Then, on March 1st, 2018, Larry's body washes ashore near Sunup Bay, nearly 3 miles from the spot where Lori said he went into the lake. An autopsy follows, and the results contradict everything Lori had told investigators. Larry Eisenberg did not drown. The coroner determines the true cause of death is diphenhydramine toxicity, poisoning from a massive dose of Benadryl. For Larry's family, the news lands like a second loss. His son Dean later put it simply, "I was in shock. I just couldn't believe he fell overboard." Now he was being told his father hadn't fallen at all. The community around Lake Coeur d'Alene felt it too. One neighbor described the atmosphere in the days that followed as almost impossible to process. "We can't even grieve his loss," she said, "because everything is so weird." And there was something else unfolding at the same time. Something that, in hindsight, is hard to look past. While search crews were still combing the lake for her missing husband, neighbors noticed Lori moving belongings out of the home she and Larry had shared. Boxes, personal items, things quietly leaving the house even as the search for Larry was still underway. A husband still missing, a body not yet found, and a wife already packing up the life they'd built together. With Larry's body recovered and a cause of death that made no sense with the story he'd been told, authorities were now running 2 investigations at once, one into a missing $500,000 and one into a man's death. The forensic evidence was the first thread to pull. That bloody latex glove and the bloody tissue, discovered during a search warrant tied to the fraud case, hadn't gone anywhere. Investigators also had blood found inside the boat itself, blood Lori had attributed to an injury she said she sustained trying to reach her husband. On its own, that explanation might have held up. Alongside everything else, it became one more detail that didn't quite fit. Then came the paper trail, and it told a different story every time. In her 911 call, Lori suggested Larry may have suffered a stroke. In a later email, she shifted the explanation to a mechanical failure with the boat's motor. In a written letter to friends, she offered yet another account of exactly how he'd gone into the water. 3 different versions, from the same woman, describing the same morning. At the same time, forensic accountants were working through years of financial records, tracing the ghost companies back to Lori's name, following the forged checks, matching the unauthorized credit cards to purchases that had nothing to do with the nonprofit she ran. The trail didn't stop with Lori. Several of her daughters were implicated in a related conspiracy, accused of helping move the money. In November 2018, Larry Eisenberg pleaded guilty in federal court to wire fraud and federal program theft, admitting to embezzling more than $500,000 from the North Idaho Housing Coalition. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $570,000 in restitution. Several of her daughters pleaded guilty to related conspiracy charges of their own. On paper, that might have looked like the end of the story. A financial crime, punished, closed. It wasn't. Even as Lori began serving her federal sentence, she remained the central person of interest in her husband's death. Behind the scenes, the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office kept working the case, quietly, methodically, for 2 more years, before they were ready to bring a different kind of charge against her entirely. For 2 years, detectives worked quietly in the background, taking apart Larry Eisenberg's story piece by piece. A spontaneous accident doesn't leave a bloody glove hidden in a garbage can. It doesn't leave a wallet, a license, and credit cards sitting untouched inside the house. And it doesn't come with three different explanations for how it happened: a stroke, a broken motor, a fall, each one told to a different person at a different time. Then there was the toxicology. Larry hadn't shown signs consistent with simply drowning. What he had in his system was a massive, deliberate dose of an over-the-counter sedative, the kind of amount that doesn't end up in someone's body by accident. Investigators drew their conclusion. Larry had a motive sitting right in front of them, an embezzlement scandal about to become public, a life about to collapse. And they came to believe she had poisoned a drink that her husband ultimately consumed. On February 24, 2020, 2 years, almost to the week, after Larry disappeared into the water, Larry Eisenberg was arrested and charged with first-degree murder by use of poison. The news split the Isenberg family in two. Some relatives remembered a marriage that had, to them, always looked genuinely loving, and they struggled to square that memory with the charges now in front of them. Others, particularly on Larry's side of the family, felt differently. To them, the truth had been sitting in plain sight all along, in the bloody glove, in the shifting stories, in a wife who was moving boxes out of the house before her husband's body had even been found. Two families, two very different versions of the same woman, and now a courtroom that would have to decide which one was real. In February 2021, still behind bars serving her federal sentence for fraud, Larry Eisenberg returned to court, this time to face the charge connected to her husband's death. She entered what's known as an Alford plea to a reduced charge of second-degree murder. It's a legal distinction worth understanding. An Alford plea doesn't require Larry to admit guilt. It only requires her to acknowledge that prosecutors have enough evidence to convict her at trial. In the eyes of the law, the case was resolved. In her own words, Larry still wasn't saying she did it. At her sentencing hearing, she offered one final version of events, her fourth. She told the court that after the embezzlement was exposed, she had mixed a lethal dose intending to end her own life. Larry, she said, drank it by accident instead. Judge Scott Wayman didn't accept it. He rejected her account outright at sentencing. In May 2021, Larry Eisenberg was sentenced to 30 years to life in Idaho State Prison. She will not be eligible for parole until 2050, meaning, at minimum, she will spend nearly 3 decades behind bars. For Larry's family, the sentencing didn't bring the closure some had hoped for. There was grief, still raw 3 years later. And for many, there was frustration that the Alford plea let Larry walk away from the courtroom without ever having to say, out loud, what she had actually done. Justice, in this case, arrived, but it arrived without a confession. And for a family still trying to make sense of how they lost Larry, that absence would linger long after the sentence was handed down. When the headlines fade and the court dates become a matter of record, what remains is a much simpler story, the life of one man. Larry Eisenberg was a forestry graduate who built a career in the lumber industry he loved. He was a father who stayed close to his children long after his first marriage ended. He was a man who told his son that every day was the greatest day of his life, and meant it. He was also a husband who trusted completely, trusted enough not to question a wife who was, behind closed doors, moving money through his own name. Trusted enough to believe, for 14 years, that the little paradise they'd built together on Bobcat Trail was exactly what it looked like. It wasn't. This case leaves behind more than a verdict. It leaves behind a hard question. How well can any of us really know the person sleeping beside us? How financial pressure and the fear of public exposure can build, quietly, for years, until it finally breaks something that can never be fixed. And how a home filled with hummingbirds and a garden and photographs of a happy marriage can still be hiding a secret capable of ending a life. Larry Eisenberg spent his life believing every day was the best one yet. He never got the chance to see how his story would end. But his family, and the truth that finally surfaced from the waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene, made sure his story wouldn't be forgotten.